Welcome. I'm Mary Jordan. I'm the editor of Washington Post Live. It's the two-year-old arm of the media company that organizes forums and debates on the most important issues of the day. So that's why we're here today, to talk about who will lead the World Bank next. I was a foreign correspondent for 14 years, based in Tokyo, and then Mexico, and then London. And as someone who's worked in a lot of countries, I can certainly attest to the importance and the potential of the World Bank's role. We are streaming live right now on WashingtonPostLive.com, as well as the website for the Center for Global Development. So welcome to all our online viewers who are also tweeting and sending in questions. And I'm now delighted to introduce Nancy Birdsall. She is the Center for Global Development's founding president, and she also worked for the World Bank for 14 years in many roles, including Director of Policy Research Department. She's also served as the Executive Vice President for the Inter-American Bank, where she oversaw a $30 billion budget for public and private loan portfolio. Nancy is the author, the co-author, or the editor of more than a dozen books and over 100 articles in scholarly journals and monographs. So I turn you now to Nancy Birdsall, a woman who knows quite a bit about global development.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you to the Washington Post and Washington Post Live for partnering with us in organizing these events. I'm very pleased to be joined today, again, as yesterday, by Howard Schneider, a staff writer at the Washington Post, who covers international economics and has been tracking closely the unprecedented competition for the presidency of the World Bank. After we hear from our keynote speaker, José Ocampo, Howard will kick off a discussion by interviewing him, and then we'll take questions from the audience, including the global audience watching on the live webcast. I do want to welcome all of you here, as well as those online. We have today, here and online, ambassadors, heads of think tanks and NGOs, members of the business community and the media, leading academics, senior officials from the World Bank, the IMF, and other multilateral organizations. And it is really good to see the interest in the international development community in what happens at the World Bank. Before I welcome and introduce our speaker, I want to make 3 quick points. First, it does matter who leads the World Bank. The bank is the world's preeminent development institution. For all its faults, it is the global institution dedicated to economic development and poverty reduction. We see this each time the world's most powerful leaders in the G8 and in the G20 gather to seek ways to address their shared problems. What do? More often than not, the pledges they make for collective action to increase economic growth, reduce poverty, wind up in the World Bank as the institutional home for actually implementing the decisions that they make. Of course, the president of the bank does report to the board, which in turn represents the nations of the world, but the fact is that the president himself or herself has immense influence to lead and cajole the members into empowering the bank to take actions that are in their own best long-term shared interest. That's the first point. Second, it matters how the bank president is chosen. My colleagues and I at the center have been among the many voices in the international community urging an open and competitive selection process without regard to nationality. An open and competitive and transparent process helps ensure that the best candidate is ultimately elected and has the broad support and legitimacy that's necessary to lead. Third, the current competition is unprecedented. We have, for the first time, 3 officially nominated candidates, all of whom are being interviewed by the bank's executive board. Indeed, our speaker today has just come from his interview. Today's event we see as part of that process. Regardless of the outcome, it's hard to imagine that we will ever return to a situation that prevailed just 5 years ago when Robert Zoellick was nominated by the US president and the board's choice was only to vote yes or no. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. José Antonio Ocampo is a globally renowned Colombian economist. He currently serves as the director of the Economic and Political Development Concentration at Columbia University and a fellow of the Committee on Global Thought. In his home country of Colombia, he has been, among other things, kind of a minister of many things, Minister of Agriculture, the Director of Planning, Minister of Finance, and Chair of the Central Bank Board. He is a scholar practitioner in the best sense of the word. In 2008, he received the Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. He has had an impressive career as an international civil servant at the United Nations, most notably as head of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and more recently as head of ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council at the UN. His candidacy, as some of you may know, has been endorsed publicly by over 100 economists. In the spirit of disclosure, full spirit of disclosure, I should say that I have known José Antonio for at least 2 decades, going back to my time working on Latin America. He has a chapter in a book that I co-edited on Latin American development after the global financial crisis. That's his chapter. And he influenced my thinking about the relationship between changing macroeconomic conditions and social policy in the developing world. I think I have a chapter in a forthcoming book he is editing. Please join me in welcoming José Antonio Ocampo.
Well, let me thank the Center for Global Development and the Washington Post for this invitation to be with you today, the audience here and the audience online, for this presentation of my views on the World Bank. As Nancy already said, this is an unprecedented process, and I just come from an unprecedented interview, which was, never in my life I had had a 3.5-hour interview. So it's, it was a bit exhausting by the time I was finished. But let me briefly present to you the views that I actually presented to the board. I also wrote them down in a couple of op-eds, one published by the Financial Times last week, and one published by Project Syndicate last week, which reflect views of the World Bank and my views of development. So let me start by my views of development, stating that I summarize that in 3 basic principles. The basic principle, number 1, let's say, is that economic success or development success has always been the result of a good mix of markets, states, and society. So markets, because it is quite clear that private enterprise has a leading role in economic growth. The states, because without the state action, we have known many processes that lead to very inequitable outcomes, and also very unstable outcomes, because the global financial crisis is just one of the many cases in which the lack of good state intervention actually led to a monumental crisis. And society, because of course the social actors are central to let's say, to democratic decision making. And also, and very importantly, because we have known from many development experience that social actors can also be very important for development, particularly at the community level. And today, the issue of social entrepreneurs, of social innovations at the local level are really central to many successful development experiences, particularly for the poor. My second principle is that the mix between markets and state and society have to be nationally rooted. They have to be the source of processes that are grounded at the national level, are, as it has come to be called, there is deep ownership. There is no way to impose development or a particular pattern of development. And I say the World Bank in the past made the mistake of trying to preach the world a particular model of development. Fortunately, that is something that has been changing for some time and in a positive direction. So development has to be owned by countries. There is no success without deep ownership of development processes. And third, that development is an integral process. It involves economic dimensions, it involves social dimensions, environmental dimensions, and institutional dimensions that make the process subject to good governance or to bad governance. And in each of those dimensions, of course, we can dwell it for some time. I'm going to skip that just to go into what I sense is my interpretation of the role of the bank and the instruments that the bank has for doing so. So in my presentation, I have been emphasizing that the World Bank has three major objectives, or should have three major objectives. The first one is the historic objective, of poverty reduction. Poverty reduction, notably, of course, in the poorest countries of the world, but also in the middle-income countries, because actually most of the poor of the world live in middle-income countries. So it would be a great mistake for the bank to leave middle-income countries aside. Can come back to this issue. And it has to be done, do that with a comprehensive strategy that involves the dimensions that I already mentioned. The second objective, or let me say the second and third objective, look at the more global responsibilities of the bank. So the second is the responsibility for the provision of what have come to be called the global public goods, which in particular, in the case of the bank, given the financial responsibilities or the financial demands, as well as the demands for knowledge, relate in particular to the issue of climate change, which is, of course, a major challenge for humanity ahead of us. And the third, that is a responsibility that I must say the bank has started to work with. It has to do it in close interaction with other actors, because it's not only the responsibility of the bank. The UN system is the forum for negotiations, and there is now a global climate fund that has been created that is going to be a separate institution and will play a very important role in that regard. And the third is actually a novel proposal of a function for the bank, which is to serve as a forum for dialogue on long-term development of the global economy. I think the fact that we have a set of rising emerging economies that are now actually the leaders in world economic growth, at the same time that we have industrial economies that are facing difficulties, and a map of diverse developing countries makes actually the bank a very important forum to discuss the issues of long-term development of the global economy, the trade, the investment flows, the migration flows, the knowledge flows that require that process of development, and how you make that consistent with a process that is beneficial for everybody and equitable at the different levels. So those are the three major objectives that I have in my presentations proposed for the bank. And then I analyze four instruments that the bank has, which I think are important to understand what it can do and what it cannot do. The first instrument is financing, concessional financing for the poorest countries and non-concessional financing, which in fact is the non-concessional financing is sort of cooperative financing, because the bank is in a sense a world credit union. So the financing is made available on a cost basis, or cost plus basis, which makes it very affordable for many countries that do not have good access to international private capital markets. And that is a function that it plays also in the case of a concessional financing more through one of these institutions, the IDA, and the other through the other institution, which is the IBRD, two of the four institutions that make up the World Bank Group. The second is knowledge. The bank is a major center of research, the largest center of research on development issues in the world, but it's also knowledge based on experience, on country programs and how you use the knowledge accumulated from country programs in order to service other countries, but also to increase knowledge about development processes. Again, it's very important that the bank continues to serve both low and middle income countries, because the knowledge accumulated from experience of bank programs in middle income countries will certainly serve many low income countries of the world. The third is this very privileged relation with the private sector. The other two institutions of the World Bank Group are actually dedicated to the private sector, the International Finance Corporation and MIGA. So that the role as a promoter of private sector or supporter of private sector investment in developing countries is, I think, a very important role. It's a very privileged role, actually, that the bank has. It's not a question of the magnitude of financing, which will always be limited vis-a-vis the private sector, but it's what, in the international discussions called the catalytic role, the capacity to leverage a limited amount of financing in order to bring more private investment into the developing countries. And I say, particularly looking forward, I think there are many interesting issues that you can think of in terms of that role, but at least two I want to mention: the fact that the private investment in low-income countries in non-natural resource intensive sectors is something that should be subject to a special attention in that activity. And also the very interesting role of attracting investment by the large firms that are now headquartered in developing countries, particularly in the largest emerging economies, that can bring a lot of investment into low-income countries. So it's a south-south investment, as it can be called. And finally, the fourth instrument is actually linking with the rest of the international system of cooperation. And this is an activity in which, in my view, the bank has probably been less good, let's say, in some of its dimensions. I think there are three different parts of the international system which the bank links to. The one which I think works best is the relation with the IMF, and I guess you can say the Financial Stability Board now, which is, let's say, is a role as part of the apex of the international financial architecture. That relation, I think, works relatively well. The second one is relation to the UN system, in which, from my own experience for working for the UN for 10 years, I will say that the relation is much less good, and there is a significant room for improvement in terms of linking better with the different parts of the system according to the special responsibilities of the different UN agencies. Let's say FAO on agriculture, or ILO on labor issues, or WHO in health issues, et cetera, et cetera. I think that relation can be improved significantly. It can also be used to rationalize the work of the bank by avoiding the duplication of activities in the different areas of competence of the different UN agencies. And finally, the world of multilateral development banks is what I have been calling in my writings a dense system. A system that is made of the World Bank, regional development banks, sub-regional banks, at least one interregional bank, which is the Islamic Development Bank, some national development banks that are active internationally in lending. So it's a system that is actually dense. It has many institutions as part of it. It's very different from the international monetary architecture, where you have the IMF and little else. So that I have for a long time said, well, we need for the world international monetary architecture a denser system such as the one we have for multilateral development banks. But that in the issue of the role of the World Bank means that it also has to improve, to work with that system, to be the leader in a sense of that system of banks, and use it in a complementary way to achieve different objectives. I think in the areas where we have huge demands for financing, we'll probably have a complementary function, for example, the issues of climate change. But in others, it can be supportive of the regional institutions. For instance, regional integration should be a particular role of regional banks. But the World Bank can have a supportive role in that process. And it can also help create more institutions of the kind that we have. For instance, Latin America and the Caribbean have actually 3 successful institutions at the sub-regional level. We have the Andean Development Corporation, which is now called the Latin American Development Bank. We have the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, and we have the Caribbean Development Bank. I think there is a possibility of helping develop similar systems throughout the world, because those institutions we have learned in Latin America and the Caribbean are actually quite good for us. So actually having a system in which you have the different levels of institutions is good for countries. And I can give testimony of that from the point of view of my time in the government of Colombia, that it was always good to have several alternatives of financing for our products. So that is, in a nutshell, the proposal that I have been making about the World Bank that I presented today to the board and that I will be presenting in my writings. And again, thank you to Nancy and Howard for this invitation to be with you today.
So mic's on, everything good? Can we hear? Good. That's 2. Nancy, is your mic working?
Yes, I
Good.
think so.
All right.
Okay, is mine working? Yes.
Good. Well, I bet you wish it weren't at this point. You're probably talked out, right?
More or less.
More than talked out. Well, look, thank you for sticking with us for a little bit of time here to take some questions from the audience. We've had some coming in online, and I will kick things off, if I could, just with a question or two, and sort of taking off some of the, you mentioned in your comments here about the mix of priorities that the bank is facing, the mix of instruments it has, and reading the essays you published over the last few days, the FT and elsewhere, hearing comments yesterday at the forum, and really talking to people who've focused on bank and development issues, you do find different, the language is very similar. We're all interested in poverty reduction, jobs, sustainability, health, education, advancement of women. I guess the difference is going to be in strategies and priorities, right? How you get from point A to point B on some of these topics. So what I'd like to know is, given your decades in development now, 30 years and counting, what would set your presidency apart if you get that job? And specific strategies you'd import, you'd bring to the table. More significantly, I guess, how you'd balance the different competing goals. Is job generation and poverty reduction more important at this point than controlling carbon use? Should investments in health and education take priority over infrastructure and hard goods to the extent that you've got limited resources to bring to bear on any one of these things? So what do you think is going to define your leadership and the balance you'd see in these?
Okay. Well, let me say that in the issue of poverty reduction, I think the views are probably very similar. I would, I will emphasize a few issues more than some of my other colleagues. But I think we have a sense that that has been the historical mandate of the World Bank. It should continue to be. I guess in relation to some of the discussions in the board, what I'll be emphatic is that a World Bank without supporting middle-income countries is not the World Bank that the world needs. I think it's not the World Bank that the low-income countries need. I think the involvement of the bank with middle-income countries is critical for its capacity to support low-income countries. Now, the other two roles, particularly in the issue of climate change, and you can think of maybe other global public goods, I think the role is really essential. And in a sense, makes a transformation from a institution that was based or had as major objective poverty reduction to a contributing institution to the management of our global commons, which is a major demand today in the world. So that's a really, truly global role. It means transforming the bank from a development institution into a global cooperation institution. And that's also the other role, which is my proposal, because it's not, nobody else has made it, of really using the bank more as a forum for dialogue between industrial economies and emerging economies. I think the emerging economies are demanding a closer voice in the development system and the global cooperation system. And I think the bank can actually be a very good instrument. Now, in terms of the instruments, I think I am unique among the candidates in emphasizing the importance of cooperation with the rest of the international system, which I think is a very important issue, is an area that, aside from the relation with the IMF, the World Bank has not been particularly strong. And I said that, having worked in the UN for 10 years, that I think there's a lot of improvement to be made, and that, by working more closely together, and I guess Nancy could probably make some comments on the relation with the regional banks and in that, which is a bit better than relations with the UN system. But I think there is a significant, very important to conceive the system of global governance as a system, and the World Bank as one of the actors in that system. So that I think is a very. The other issues, you can say that there will probably be different emphasis. Again, in the issue of financing, there is not. My emphasis on involvement with middle-income countries, as well as in the area of knowledge, is very important. Now, you can say the other thing that has been in the debate is the importance of an internal versus an external candidate. And in terms of the capacity to lead change in the institution, someone coming from the outside has advantages of not having been involved in the processes, and therefore with the capacity to look at it from the outside and say, well, this doesn't look to be going well in this case. It is okay in this other case, and we can continue to emphasize that.
Let me follow up on, if I could, on this issue of sort of global governance and cooperation, because you've seen, for example, with the efforts at the Group of 20 to elevate that into sort of a global decision-making body, sort of staffed by the IMF, but a place where policy could be synchronized and everybody's rowing in the same direction. And the results are very mixed. I think you'd have to agree. It seemed to work when everybody's interests were aligned. Well, they'd all do the same thing, right? Because their interests were aligned. But as soon as they started to clash, they'd all go their separate ways. How do you elevate a body like the World Bank, which is much less compact than the Group of 20, into that kind of decision-making body?
No, I understand the difficulties involved, which doesn't mean that you should not try to do it. I mean, you take any major global issue, I mean, of course, it's quite difficult. Take the climate change negotiations going on in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and you see that there are significant difficulties, significant divergence of views. But at the end, you have to go through that process, and then you have to develop the instruments that can help the world go in that direction. And let me say, for example, that the World Bank is going to be a central player in that process. It's already starting to work in that direction. It has its own financing tools, but it has its knowledge tools. I mean, the work that the bank has been doing on knowledge on climate change issues is very important. And of course, now that the bank has returned to the area of infrastructure, which is something that it left for some not clear reasons in the past. I mean, its capacity to help design energy systems in developing countries that are more climate friendly is, I think, a very important role that it can play together with the other parts of the system.
Okay. Let me, if I could, turn to the book that you edited, recently published, Time for a Visible Hand, with Joseph Stiglitz and Stephanie Griffith-Jones. You talked of how the current dollar reserve system could disadvantage developing nations. In many ways, you put on the table to sort of reform the system towards, I think the phrase you used was a development bias. So there are lots of ideas for the IMF in there. Is there any role for the World Bank in that process, do you think?
No, that was really aimed at the IMF.
Yeah, okay.
So that was more an article on the IMF.
So, all right.
Yeah, and it's actually about designing, because it has to do with my view that the international monetary system should look more like the international system of the multilateral development banks. Mm-hmm. They're having a system in which you have more actors and in playing the role of international monetary support, you have a better system. So that's part of the ideas, together with other specific issues about reserve creation for the global economy. But those are mostly IMF issues.
So tell us about the board meeting a little bit today, about the interview. How did it go? What did you? How was the interplay?
No, it was interesting. I mean, it's 25 directors, each of them asking 2 to 5 questions. Mm-hmm. You can multiply. It's quite a bit. It involved actually many things about my own background. Uh-huh. So they asked for a lot of details to see if I was qualified. So that's interesting. And more general development issues. I guess Ngozi will probably ask more about her background and very specific issues in the bank. Mm-hmm. I was, in my case, it was probably more the philosophy of the type of intervention that I think the bank could do, how it relates to other institutions, how the issue of middle-income countries, the issue of actually also and very importantly, particularly for the role of civil society, the issue of transparency, accountability, my relations with the board, how I saw that. So it was pretty full.
Yeah.
I just multiplied questions and see that they asked about everything they could have asked.
Well, I'm tempted to ask you which directors asked 2 questions and which asked 5, but I'll hold off on that and see if Nancy has anything she'd like to put on the table here.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Let me start with this issue of climate and global public goods in general, where I think you've been very clear about the potential for the bank to be more active. The question is, how do you see the bank moving in that direction? It's already heavily involved. not with lots of money, but through the trust funds like the Climate Investment Fund. The question is whether, and this has come up in the past with others, should the bank have more capital? And if so, where would the capital come from to deal with global public goods? And should it have more of a clear mandate? At the moment, its activities are kind of ad hoc, often at the behest of a particular donor that wants to put money in the bank in the form of a trust fund to do something, but doesn't really have a mandate overall to work on collective goods. And of course, the problem is that the bank's key instrument or instruments have always been loans or guarantees that are country specific, which makes it's a barrier to doing activities that require an instrument that is not country specific.
I think that's a very good question. I mean, first of all, in this area, it is quite clear that the bank with its own resources, I mean, I'll talk about the capital later on, but its own resources can make a contribution because of its involvement in the area of infrastructure. I mean, the critical issue in climate change is the energy infrastructure and the characteristics of that, of the investments. And since developing countries are going to be the source of the largest increase in the demand for energy, the role of the bank in that regard is important. And that means actually let's say the criterion of being, both a contribution to global public goods, but also national policy. So I don't think that there is much problem in that regard. It's actually, less difficult than the areas that you probably could think of, which is, and which actually is a problem also for regional development banks, which are investments that require more than one country. For instance, regional infrastructure, linking, for instance, energy systems,
electricity grids,
or gas pipelines, or in which there is a significant challenge for all multilateral development banks. And I think that's probably an area in which there must be an innovation that allows somehow to have infrastructure projects that are multinational. I said today when asking about that question, because it was from one of the Europeans, that actually the best example in the world is actually the European Investment Bank, which has done a very good job at developing the regional infrastructure of the European integration. And so that maybe working with the European Investment Bank on how the model is and how to improve that could be a significant improvement. So there are cases where you have national investments and cases in which you have really regional networks that will have to be designed in a different way. Now, about the capital, I think one of the good things that the World Bank did in recent years was the support for developing countries during the global financial crisis. I mean, it's quite clear that the increase in financing was very important. It was more commitments initially than disbursements, and that's probably one problem that we can talk about. Why the bank is so slow in disbursing, which is a very important issue. But it was very important. I mean, in Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, you see the ranking, and the World Bank was the most dynamic, and then the Inter-American, and then the sub-regional banks that were, have less capacity to increase financing significantly during the crisis, which the World Bank had the capacity to do. But unfortunately, when the time came for capital increase, the current president was too shy, I think, in asking for a capital increase. All the other development banks got a huge capitalization. It was true of the Inter-American, it was true of the Asian Development Bank, or the African Development Bank.
and well, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Also.
And somehow the World Bank did not. And I think that is the reason why now the bank is decreasing its lending significantly because it cannot have a larger portfolio given its capital. So at one point, and sooner rather than later, we have to, the bank will have to negotiate a capital increase. Of course, it's a challenging issue, particularly on the U.S. side, also the European side. But I mean, the significant constraint in that regard is actually the United States, which is the major shareholder, because it says that it cannot get the money through Congress, but it doesn't want to lose share in the capital. Right. So that means that we are stuck with the World Bank, which is in a sense constrained by its major shareholder.
So as a kind of follow up to that, I mean, how would you see, as president of the World Bank, working your way through that? Obviously, some of the countries in Latin America, China, have indicated some willingness to make their own additional capital contributions, but that requires this, in effect, dilution of the capital of the existing most influential members. Is that something you see as a challenge, including in terms of collective action in an area like climate?
Yes, although in the area of climate, there is also this global climate fund that is going to be created, that actually the bank is managing now, but it's going to be an independent institution according to the negotiations. So that is actually, in terms of funding, supposed to be the largest contributor. But then, as in the case of the Global Environmental Facility, the bank can actually play a very significant role, because the World Bank is really unique, or stands out among the rest of the multilateral development banks in this real capacity to mix knowledge with financing. So in some cases, actually can contribute to the knowledge part of the operations, even if it's not fully involved in the financing part. I mean, in that regard, I think it's on top, really, of the other banks for its knowledge capacities, let's say. So whether you need a huge amount of financing for that, I said yes, to the extent that it involves national progress. But yes, it's going to be it's a difficult negotiation process. I think it's unfortunate that the World Bank lost the opportunity to ask for a larger capital increase. So the next one, yes, I think the U.S. and the Europeans will have to think whether they want to do their own capitalization or allow other economies to do.
Or some combination.
Yeah, or some combination, which I actually think that the pressure of losing a share in the bank may be a good incentive to get more capital.
Another quick
I want to put one more thing, just because you raised the issue of and then we'll go out to the audience here, the financial sector response during the crisis. I wanted to see if there was a discussion here to be had about this sort of accretion of, and we talked a little bit about this already, the accretion of things that the World Bank does. Now, the bank's outside auditor, the independent evaluation group, in looking at the bank's crisis response, found a lot to commend. But in the case of the financial sector, they were saying, their conclusion, I think, I wrote it down here, the bank's lending to its client countries was not correlated with the differential stress experienced by these countries. There was a sense that, this may have not been an optimal response on the bank's part. And I was wondering whether or not, given the IMF's increasing resource base, flexibility, willingness to move more quickly into different countries, whether that's an area that the bank might step away from.
No, I think there are two significant differences in this regard between the IMF and the World Bank. The first one is that the IMF, strictly speaking, is for balance of payment financing. The World Bank is not about balance of payment financing. But the bank can play a significant role in terms of maintaining or increasing a public sector investment during the crisis. So as to avoid an adverse effect of the crisis on public sector investment, or even support an additional investment and as a countercyclical tool. I think that's a separate, really separate function. It's also separate in the sense of the time frame, because the lending by the World Bank is longer term than that of the IMF. But also very important, the second real significant difference and why the bank has to be involved in this regard is because there are many more countries willing to borrow from the World Bank than from the IMF. So I think that's why I think the World Bank has to be involved. As actually, all the multilateral development bank systems should be involved in countercyclical financing, also because of the fiscal implications. It's a separate issue from balance of payment. Even if a country doesn't have a balance of payment problem, it may have a problem maintaining its fiscal investment program during the crisis. And that is a role for the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks to play.
Okay. Let me ask one more question, because Jose Antonio raised this issue about better relations with the UN system, and you've spent a lot of time yourself, both in Santiago at ECLAC and then in New York. Can you give us I think some of the issue is that the supporters of the bank, the member countries, they see the bank as more effective. Maybe the UN is seen as more legitimate on certain issues, but the World Bank is seen as more effective. My sense is that there has been a big effort, especially in the last decade, on the part of the management at the World Bank to interact more with the UN. But maybe you could say something about, either when you were at ECOSOC or at CEPAL at ECLAC, your frustrations in relations with the World Bank or the other multilateral, or the other, well, it would be the Inter-American Development Bank.
Well,
or an example of where you would see the scope for progress. I mean, you said, maybe I'm not being very clear, but you said that there should be an avoidance of duplication in terms of what these different international organizations are providing. What are you thinking?
No, well, let me say that I myself had an easier time working with the IMF than with the World Bank.
When you were at ECLAC?
No, when I was in the UN, in New York. The IMF has a clear sense of its mandate. So you can interact with the IMF from the UN perspective. You may diverge in opinions, and you can have a discussion, but it was generally easy to work with the IMF. With the World Bank, it was extremely difficult, actually, even in recognizing the relations with the UN system. And there are particular cases that you can think of. I mean, there has been a consistent objection on some of the indicators of the labor market that the bank uses in its doing business report from the ILO, which considers that in the doing business report, the World Bank is using indicators that, from the point of view of the ILO, reduce labor, the protection of workers.
Also
okay?
from
that's one particular confrontation. But beyond that, you think, for example, look at the ILO has done a lot of very interesting interactions with WTO and the IMF in recent years. Not so much with the World Bank. So I mean, I think there's a culture in the World Bank. So you can say, well, in other dimensions, the work is actually quite good. When the World Bank is willing to really cooperate on an equal basis, the work actually goes on well. For instance, in countries in post-conflict situations, in which the World Bank recognizes that the United Nations has a clear leadership on political issues. and doesn't want to get involved in political issues. In that case, the cooperation actually works well. I think the problem, sincerely, the problem of working for the World Bank is the sense, let's say, of superiority.
So you're talking about.
So I think you have the bank staff has to be willing to recognize that they're equals.
So you're talking about bringing some change of culture.
Yes, a change of culture. I mean, I was asked that question: what changes of culture do you think the bank requires?
What did you say?
Well, the first one is that the bank staff, since the bank wants to be a client-based organization, and the first thing that the staff have to learn is that it is working at the country level is actually an improvement in its role for the bank. Rather than working in Washington. So that's one change of culture. You know that many of these, in bank culture and as in actually not few international organizations, being sent to a poor country to work for the program is seen as a more difficult job, let's say. But my sense is, well, if you want to have a client-based institution that is supporting development, going to the countries for programs should be actually seen as one of the major jobs that you have in life. Okay, so that's one change in culture, and the other is you have to recognize that there are capable people in other international institutions with which you can work on an equal basis. And I really said no.
Did they laugh?
No, they laugh. I think it's
They're laughing up the street, I think.
I think it's an important it's an important point. I mean, from my point of view, that's having lived through that relation for 10 years, I think is an important point.
Very good.
Okay, well, let's see if the audience has some questions here, and then we'll also have some coming in online. We have a roving mic here. Please give us your name and affiliation, and try to keep it brief.
Thank you. Richard Bernal, Inter-American Development Bank. I'm the Executive Director for the Caribbean. You indicated in your overview of what you would like to do with the bank, the need for additional resources. In this regard, you indicated you'll be looking to China and certain emerging markets to make additional contributions. To what extent is that going to be possible without a significant redistribution of voting rights at the level of the board of the World Bank?
So my point here is that I hope all members will make their contribution. In the case of the bank, that means the capital of the bank is also important in a few years, the IDA replenishment, which Europe, for example, is critical partner because it contributes more than half of the resources for IDA. So I hope all are willing to contribute. But my point is, there are two things that have to be, of course, negotiated. They are very difficult politically. The first one should be the easiest, is that all countries should be willing to contribute according to the shares in the capital of the institution. So that will say, well, I know that there might be difficulties, but you should not. The U.S., I think, in its own interest, if it wants to keep the influence it has on the bank, should be willing to put the additional capital according to the share. But if it's not willing, or some European country is not willing to do so, it should let others put the money. So I think actually the pressure of the second should help the first. So that, and I think it's in the interest of the major industrial countries to contribute to the capitalization. It's not a huge demand, actually, when you think of it, relative to the resources of countries. I mean, we're not talking about an immense amount of money. So I think that would be my answer to it.
Through the magic of Twitter here, I want to turn to a couple of online questions real quick. sort of grouped in themes, interestingly, from Norway and Tanzania, courtesy of Rakesh Rajani and Ingrid Kavangraven. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. People want to know about results-based lending, cash-on-delivery aid. Rajani writes, should the World Bank invest much more in paying for outcomes and rewarding progress rather than funding inputs, a la cash-on-delivery aid? Any thoughts about that topic?
Well, that was this new instrument of results-based financing. It's actually a recent, very interesting innovation of the bank. It has actually one advantage and a potential disadvantage. This is, for those of you who don't know about this, is an instrument in which financing is disbursed based on specific indicators of results. So you don't get, you have, in the lending, you have an objective in terms of your program, and if you don't meet it, you don't get disbursement. If you do, you meet the objective, then you get disbursement. So it's an instrument that is very novel. I actually support it fully. The great advantage of that instrument is that you rely on countries' specific systems for implementation of a program. So you don't, in a sense, you don't necessarily use the one that the World Bank would prefer, but you actually use the one that countries have built. So I think that's a very interesting advantage of that instrument. The disadvantage, I think, is much easier for, let's say, a country with good institutional frameworks to use that type of lending. So I would say that low-income countries may have more difficulties using that system. So I would say that that's the disadvantage of the system. But on the other hand, the way the World Bank is selling the product, which I think is good, is that it also helps build the institutional framework that allows a country to execute that type of lending. So I think that's a good instrument.
So the system is backed with presumably governance structures and implementation structures for the countries that need it.
Right. I think that's the advantage if it works well. And I think that's the way the bank is presenting. It has actually, it's part of a broader, very positive evolution of the bank towards results-based programming, which actually with even a very good system of designing the results at different levels of the programs.
And if you had any thoughts on that, since it's something you've been very...
Yes, I've worked on this, and we have at the center. So thank you. Let me have a follow-up question. I think that, we've expressed concern that is similar to what you said, that it's an instrument easier to use where countries already have adequate systems. I think the question that always comes up has to do with the safeguards, fiduciary, environmental, and social. To what extent, how can the bank over time handle the difficult trade-off between working with a country that should have ownership, where the country does have ownership, right? But it may not yet meet, say, the environmental and social standards that would permit it actually to seize ownership and sort out how its own systems need to be reformed. It's a tough one, and we've been a little bit critical of the idea that the details of that instrument are now set up so that it's a lot like an investment loan of the old type, plus you must show results. But I think it's one of those areas where there will be some really important challenges going forward in how the bank proceeds that are kind of nitty-gritty and have to do with work on the ground and a little bit with the culture that you referred to. So it's the sort of thing it's not jazzy or sexy for the outside world, but I think it is one where leadership is needed inside the bank in thinking through those trade-offs country by country.
Yeah.
and listening to both the country officials and to the members of the World Bank, particularly the US, which is under the most pressure to safeguard the safeguards from NGOs and civil society.
Yeah, but if I may say, I agree with you, but the social and environmental safeguards are a broader problem, right? They apply to all of World Bank lending,
Yes.
not only to this specific new facility. So I think you're right. But it's a general, important problem. It has to do with the, as you well said, that with the capacity of or the willingness of industrial countries to contribute to use the World Bank as an instrument and to support it. So yes, the social and environmental safeguards are part of the story.
Yeah. It also goes back a little bit to the point you made about the IMF is able to respond more quickly. The bank, it's harder to respond quickly. So the trade-off is partly around the timeliness of a response. The point you made that it was hard to disperse rapidly after the financial crisis in 2009 and 10. And some of that is related to this tough trade-off about
but it's a broader problem.
making sure everything's okay before money goes out the door.
Yeah, but it's a broader problem and it's an older problem.
Yes, that's right.
It's an older problem. I mean, my time in the Colombian government, we always had three alternatives. The World Bank, I mean, in terms of multilateral banks, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Andean Development Corporation, now called the Latin American Development Bank. And I would say in that map of alternatives, the World Bank was the slowest. And the Andean Development Corporation was always the fastest.
That seems to be
And it's no accident that through time, in Latin America and the Caribbean, the sub-regional banks have gained market share because they are, in that regard, more efficient. You can say, yes, there are probably less safeguards, or the ones that you were mentioning, but that's part of and I think, actually I was asked today specifically that, we said, well, what would you do? You said, well, the first thing I will do is actually an analysis of why the others are faster. So, what practices of the other multilateral banks can be brought into the World Bank to make it more efficient. Because this is also very important in terms of the capacity of the World Bank to compete with private financing. I mean, like, again, when I was in government, you could, a loan from the World Bank will take easily 1 to 2 years to negotiate, and then more to disburse. With the Andean Development Corporation, we'll have a loan in 3 to 4 months. And in the case of New York, bond financing is 1 month. So in terms of there is a lot of efficiency to gains that I think you can get into and that's very important to compete, because otherwise you may end up with a situation in which the World Bank actually cannot compete in a world in which private financing is more important. And that is a loss, I must say, for countries actually, because one thing that that the World Bank contributes that the other institutions may not, and certainly the private sector does not, is the value added of technical assistance associated to programs. So that is very important for countries. And of course, if you go for New York, JP Morgan or whatever, you don't get that. If you go for the World Bank, yes, it takes more time, but you get that. And I think that's a value added that without which actually multilateral financing, may not be so good.
Let's go back to our audience here in Florida Avenue, Washington, D.C. Gentleman right here. Yes, please.
Asrati Teferra from Books for Africa. I have 2 questions, but I'll make them brief. First one, I hear a lot the bank is a knowledge bank. You have also mentioned it earlier in your remarks. What would you do different if you were to become the bank's president and really reforming the bank's research methodology so it's more holistic and it gives room for developing countries to have a say, and then also to help them develop strategic development policies in getting more instruments. For instance, my home country, Ethiopia, the last 3 years, as I have been told by people from the country, it's receiving more money from remittances than the official aid, development aid. So what would the bank do, for example, in a crisis like this where resources are very tight, to monetize these remittances, which are discretionary spending by the people, institutionalize them to fund development? The second is education. Um, there is a push for elementary enrollment globally with MDG and other national governments. It is true education is important. A mother with education, at least who read and write, is better than a mother who doesn't. But in many developing countries, these kids pushed through the elementary school system through several international initiatives without putting any secondary and post-secondary education that will make them innovators and producers. They would become migrating into cities and urban centers that would create another social problem. What would the bank do on this aspect as well? Thank you.
Yeah, my understanding is actually that let's say the restriction, to put it that education loans will be only for primary, something that the bank has been moving away from. So now is starting to lend again to all levels of education. So I think that is, I think that was probably a mistake in the past, although it had a good aspect to it, because after all, particularly for low-income countries, achieving at least the universal primary education has been a fundamental role. Is one of the Millennium Development Goals. So, yeah, the education system is a holistic system that includes not only primary but also secondary, university, and technical education. So you have to think of the support of the system in that regard. And I think the bank has been moving again in that direction. Now, in relation to knowledge, again, in the board interview, they asked me, in what sense would I make a difference? And I think my answer is that the bank has been forcefully moving away for some time from a very, I would say probably what I would call a more ideological position in the past. It has been broadening its scope of its work. It has actually done very good work. And at least the four last chief economists have been very open people with very good skills in different areas. So I think that has been, again, a positive move. But still, in terms of development debates, the bank is within a limited range, which is part of actually, I was actually a bit shocked by one statistic that I heard, that about 80% of new World Bank staff are recruited from the top 10 U.S. universities.
Independent of country from which
Independent
they
of country. They may be citizens of any country, but there is a bias in the hiring system towards, let's say, elite U.S. universities, such as the one in which I teach.
Probably Oxford and Cambridge.
But
anyway.
No, I just point out.
You're getting in trouble right now with your bosses,
Yes, I know. No, but my point is, just Britain is more diverse in development debates than the U.S.
Huh.
Just Britain. Not to say Western Europe and not to say the developing world. So I actually think that the World Bank has to have a broader set of development debate, has to bring people also actually from policy experience in developing countries, not necessarily from PhDs from U.S. university. I mean, a person that has practiced in a developing country may have experience that is equally or more valuable for the bank, I mean, particularly for the clients, the countries that need the support, than a good PhD from my university. I don't know. So it's a good question. But my point is, in the developing world, the range of views on development is much broader than what you get at the World Bank. I think broadening the scope of the views in the bank is actually a positive move.
Back out to the audience here. Gentleman right here.
Donald Donovan, former IMF staff member. I know this is a little bit away from your formal mandate if you were to become president, but I wondered, in terms of your broad approach to economic philosophy and policy making, could you say a little bit about the handling of by the US administration of the recent financial crisis and recession? I'm thinking specifically, would you have views on the administration policies towards, for example, helping or bailing out the banking sector on the one hand, and second, would you have supported more or less fiscal stimulus than the Obama administration has implemented?
I'm not totally sure this is
outside the remit of the World Bank, I think.
It's probably, yeah.
But you were just making the point about broadening views, so I suppose it's legitimate to be interested in your
I have been
views on.
okay. I have been a great supporter of the Federal Reserve System policy, even contrary,
QE2, QE3.
Yeah, I mean the policy of maintaining, very expansionary monetary policy in the United States. I actually, fortunately, the European Central Bank moved also in that direction after too many years of not doing that since December. I think for industrial countries they have to keep very expansionary monetary policies. In the case of fiscal policy,
if I can just interrupt to say, my understanding is that President Dilma Rousseff of Brazil complained to President Obama about the implications of that policy for.
Right. I think what you have to do is manage it some other way, and we can probably. But I think this is probably not the forum
for that.
But for the U.S. to keep a low interest rate is what it has to do, and the contribution it can make to the rest of the world economy. And I think Europe was too shy in going in that direction. Now, fiscal policy is a bit different. I think maybe I would have preferred a bit more expansionary fiscal policy in the United States, but the U.S. was not, in that regard, certainly not the worst case, and Europe was much worse. So I think the U.S. Fiscal policy was a greater stimulus, and I would say it should have been a bit larger. And I think there is a fear now that there will be a problem associated to the end, actually, of that stimulus. So I think, but anyway, that's probably not the
Let's
sort
move
of
over
question
here.
for this forum.
Sure. Let's move over to the press section here real quick, Leslie, and then we'll come over to Jo Marie here.
Professor Ocampo, Leslie Rawton at Reuters. The BRIC countries came together to nominate two candidates in an unprecedented challenge to the US. How do you think they will move forward from this position? I mean, it's clear that the cards are stacked against you and Dr. Okonjo-Iweala when you look at the votes. Do you think that the BRIC should be extracting concessions from this contest in the end?
I didn't get the question.
Okay.
Yeah, speak closer to the phone if you.
Okay. It's a South African accent, right? So I said the BRIC countries came together to nominate two candidates for this this contest. What do you think the chances are that they will carry through to the end and actually back one of you, or do you think that they would go with Dr. Kim in the end? My second question for you is that I asked this to Dr. Okonjo-Iweala yesterday. The US says that it wants to continue holding on to the World Bank top post so that it can ensure that the funding from Congress continues to go to the World Bank. What would you, as president of the World Bank, do in that case if to convince them to continue funding the World Bank? So how would a non-American convince Congress to keep those funds flowing?
No, on your first question, just a clarification, it was not BRICS that nominated us. It was the G11 plus Russia. So the G11 are the 11 directors that represent developing countries in the board, plus Russia. So 12 directors is the one that nominated us.
12 out of 25.
12 out of 25, yes.
With a very few votes.
No. It's not that few votes. I mean, add up, and they're not that. I mean, of course, the U.S. and Japan, which are a larger share, and are not part of that. So it's not that insignificant. Now, whether they will hold until the end, we'll see. In the next few days. There is all sorts of question marks about that, but I of course, as my colleague Ngozi probably want that to happen. So we'll see. We'll see. I think I think many of them are really committed to this, and it's the second issue. I'm not entirely sure that the U.S. president is necessarily an advantage from the perspective of the capital increase. I mean, I understand that the U.S. has to play a leadership role in the bank. I mean, I have no question about that, and it will continue to be the major shareholder of the bank. But in that regard, actually, for the negotiation process, a non-U.S. maybe inside the bank, which is a very difficult issue, aside from negotiation with Congress here, it's a very difficult issue also. The negotiation inside will be important, and from that perspective, being detached from being representing the largest shareholder may actually be an advantage for the internal negotiations within the bank. So the negotiations with the U.S. Congress will be equally difficult for any bank president, be it American or non-American.
Okay, back out here, José, please.
Jo Marie Griesgraber, New Rules for Global Finance. Jose Antonio, let me get to your roots and ask a radical question. You have been committed to development for years and you've been passionate about it. Where does this passion come from? It's not from the salaries you gain. Why do you have this commitment? Yesterday, Ngozi talked about living in poverty and carrying water and living in a conflict-torn country. Why do you care so much?
I mean, it's of course it's also a question about my roots. I mean, I come from a developing country, also with lots of difficulties. We can go into that. I will not. So, in a sense, of course, she comes from a poorer country with equally important difficulties. So that is, partly similar, partly not. But I also, I'm in this race also for another reason, which is the fact that I consider that the system by which the World Bank president, as well as the IMF managing director, are selected is not compatible with multilateralism. Global governance has to be done in a different way. It has to, the basic principle of multilateralism is that any citizen of a member state should have the opportunity to run for the top job if that person is qualified. And that I understood to have been the mandate of the G20 and the mandate that was followed up by the World Bank board a couple of months ago when it called this open merit-based process. So I think if we succeed this time in having an open merit-based process, it's a significant advance in multilateralism. And that's why I am contributing to this process, and we'll see whether we'll have the frustration that we had last year in choosing the IMF managing director in this process. I think in that sense, we are putting the industrial countries to account on whether they're really committed to an open merit-based process, which is what exactly they announced on this occasion. And on merits, I think I can stand this competition very well.
Okay, we are down to our last few minutes. I want to take one quick question online here, go back to the audience, and then see, Nancy, if you have any last closeout question for this. I only go back to online because it seems to be one of your students here who's Twittered in. Diana Hincapi, economist and PhD student from Columbia. And it's an interesting question. You brought up the middle income countries, that the World Bank needed to stay involved there. Largely that's done through it's almost solely now through the IBRD with IFC as well. And her question is, what do you think is the central role the World Bank should play in middle income countries? New facilities, new ideas, new programs?
Well, you can think of many things, but to start with, the World Bank has to be client-driven, so it actually should respond to the demands from countries, which may be diverse according to the country. So in principle, I would not say, well, for middle income countries, you have to have this credit line and this credit line. No, I think we should have a broad set of alternatives. And very importantly, all of the knowledge products, because I will emphasize very much that the World Bank, has a knowledge that is, in a sense, the best in the multilateral development banking system. And I think that is a very important asset of the institution. So many middle-income countries may not demand financing, but they may demand knowledge. I mean, that's the case of China. There was a major study of China just released a few months ago done between the World Bank and the Chinese authorities about the future of China. Now, there are a few very important issues. I think, for example, the area of climate change is of critical importance for the middle-income countries, more than the low-income countries in a sense, because they are being asked to play a more significant role in that process. So that's one case. And there is for example, this issue of what is called the middle-income trap now, which actually is a major preoccupation of the Chinese authorities. And that was one of the reasons why they came to the bank, which is this issue of the huge demands of middle-income countries to continue upgrading their production structure and their trade structures, which many countries have actually failed to do. And for that reason, after a period of fast growth, they end up growing very slowly or even going back. I mean, that's a typical story of many middle-income countries. And I think the bank can actually play a very significant role in helping countries, let's say, think of for instance, the technology systems that will allow them to upgrade and become world leaders in production. So those are, just some ideas about the specific role with middle income. But I will emphasize again that knowledge here may be as important as lending in the case of middle income countries.
Okay. One last one from the audience here, in the back here, gentle lady.
Thanks. It's Yufan from China's Xinhua News Agency. So this year's competition is regarded as the first true contest between three candidates. So I want to ask Mr. Ocampo, such a contest would have Do you think such a context would have far-reaching meaning to the future governance of the World Bank? Thanks.
I didn't understand far-reaching. Did you get it?
Yeah, could you repeat the
of
last
question?
bit of your question there?
The far-reaching.
Yeah, would you think such a context would have a far-reaching meaning to the governance of the World Bank in the future, whatever the outcome is?
Has the competition itself affected governance?
The far-reaching influence?
Well, no, now I get your question. I think this has already made a difference. We'll see over the next few days how much. No, I'm very serious. I am here also as a testimony. And I think Ngozi is also as a testimony. We are putting the industrial countries to account on whether, they are, when they wrote that this is an open merit-based process, it is. And I think we hope the board will analyze our CVs and our interview on the basis of merits. If this is solved just on the grounds of voting power, then we'll see next time whether this process is really the sort of process that is consistent with multilateralism. That would be my answer to this. So I think we'll see over the next few days whether this has been a process that is to the standards which the bank and the G20 before the said when it says the selection of the president of the World Bank and the selection of the managing director of the IMF should be based on merits.
So I'm going to assert moderator's prerogative here. One last question, because I was fascinated by this. It's sort of a personal thing. But I was looking at your CV online, 39 pages long, I believe it was, with books and articles, awful lot of writing and scholarship. Nancy referred to you as a scholar practitioner of the finest sort. I was wondering, though, do you see any challenge in moving from the post you're doing now, right, teaching, studying, publishing, to running that giant institution over there?
Well, I have already done it. When I was in academia, I moved into government for several years, several government positions, and then I moved into in between. Actually, I moved back into academia, and then back into the policy world. I think, if I may say, one of my good credentials in this race is, in fact, that I have been in both worlds, the world of policy and the world of academia, or let's say, using the word knowledge, which is the term that is used in the bank. I have been in policy and I have been in knowledge.
So comfortable on either side. Nancy, I'll let you close to that if you have some last thought or question you'd like to put on the table.
Ask two quick last questions and you choose. One is about the future of IDA. One of the first things you said, Jose Antonio, was the need for countries to own their policies in the context of the World Bank helping but not dictating. IDA, we have some work at the center showing that under current rules in, say, 10 or 15 years, virtually all the countries still eligible for IDA under existing arrangements are in the category called failing or flailing or failed states, where, of course, the issue is there isn't ownership. So you might say a word about how you see the future of IDA and whether you want a bigger IDA with bigger presence in those countries, with more presence in middle-income countries on issues that particularly affect the poor. That's one proposal that's out there. So there's something about the future of the IDA part of the World Bank. And the second question is, if you become the president of the World Bank, what additional changes in the selection process for the president who would succeed you would you seek? Would it be something about more transparency? in which countries voted for whom in a straw vote, say, since in the end it will be probably, as always, consensus? Would it be in the form of other more structural changes, like the double majority voting that is the current arrangement at the African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank?
I actually, to start with, I will support all of your proposals in that regard. So,
Whatever.
so the double majority voting should be the rule in the World Bank, and the process should be more transparent. Including actually, I mean, one of the big innovations is a public debate that you are promoting. But let's say not all the candidates are involved in public debate. And I think that's a significant drawback. I know, what my colleague Ngozi thinks about the bank now, but I don't know about what the U.S. candidate thinks about the bank. I mean, nobody knows. So I think that's a drawback. I think we should be subject to public debates. And I think that has been a big, important innovation. And I also agree that the voting should be also known. That's actually a bit more difficult in practice because of the tradition that at the end, the World Bank president is chosen by consensus. I mean, which is a way of, so I don't know if the board would like to see that to be open, because it's supposed to be a step in consensus building rather than a final stage. So it's a bit more difficult. On your question of IDA, yes, I think I get your point, but at the same time, I think we have to rethink the criteria for inclusion in IDA, or in let's say in the broader process of least developed countries in the United Nations, which have also lots of implications for other things. I mean, now, of course, on the criteria of income level, many low-income countries will graduate in the medium term from IDA. But it's a good question whether, I would say, I think it deserves a bit of discussion whether the criteria for inclusion should be based not on absolute poverty, but on relative poverty. Okay? So that in countries that, yes, have advanced in terms of income, but continue to be in the really low scales of worldwide income, should continue to receive a concessional lending. And I would, generally think that is positive. I mean, there's actually, the Committee of Development Policy of the UN, which is under ECOSOC, is actually going to discuss the same question regarding the classification of least developed countries. And I think I think it should be an open question. In a sense, for instance, the industrial countries is interesting, but the relative poverty is more broadly used than absolute poverty.
Right.
Okay? So maybe we should move in that direction of using relative poverty rather than absolute poverty.
Right.
Okay?
Very good.
Look, on that point, we do need to close it out. Thank you so much for your time and continuing this discussion. And just to clarify, of course, we did invite Dr. Kim to participate in a third forum. As yet, he has not accepted that invitation. And I think at this point, we probably expect him not to. But that's where we stand. I do appreciate your time, and thank you all for coming.